U.S.-China relations have many important areas of cooperation. There's a very robust economic relationship. There's a robust relationship of educational exchange. There's a kind of quasi-cooperation over the Taiwan issue. That is to say that both sides are managing that issue in a way that hasn't led to overt conflict. There's the American need for help from China in handling the Korea issue. There's the Iran issue. There's the issue of the environment. So there are many areas where there's cooperation. It doesn't mean that interests are identical, but there's significant cooperation. But at the same time, there's some important conflicts of interest. And I would say the most important and troubling conflicts of interest revolve around the sense on the part of the Chinese that the United States is threatening their security by being too forward deployed in Asia. That is to say that the U.S. has an alliance system, Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, Australia, that sort of surrounds China. And outside of the alliance system, the United States is pursuing close relations of different kinds, military and political, with other countries, Vietnam, Burma, India. And then the U.S. has its own forces deployed right in the neighborhood of China. We have our big base in Guam. We have our forces deployed in Korea and Japan. And we have active naval and air operations in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. The relationship is intensely two-sided, with important areas of cooperation as well as important, areas of conflict, and it's overlain by a very deep mistrust on both sides. That the Chinese see everything the Americans do as an attempt to protect or even expand American power in a way that's not fair and not in the interests of China. And the Americans generally tend to see everything that the Chinese do as a kind of long-term strategy to push back at American interests. The interests of both sides are, I would say, legitimate in the sense that they are real interests. China has an authentic security interest in having more influence in its periphery. The United States has an authentic security interest in protecting its kind of existing security position in the region, and so it's the aspect of mistrust and friction is very real. I really think it's way, way, way premature to speak of anything like a power transition because I'm not one of the people who thinks that the power of the United States is really declining. Our economy is coming back. People in Washington fight over the defense budget, but the defense budget remains extremely large and probably not going to go down anymore because there's, I think, a consensus in Washington that the defense budget should not be cut anymore and parts of it should be restored. And the U.S. is pulling out of gradually and bumpily pulling out of Iraq and Afghanistan, which frees up money. So, but even if the U.S. were declining, it's not going to, disappear from the face of the earth. The decline will be quite protracted. Meantime, China is GDP's growing, but the rate of growth is slowing down. The military, now we see that with the anti-corruption campaign, indicting 18 generals, we see that the Chinese military machine, which is untested in combat since the time that China invaded Vietnam and lost that war, that the Chinese military machine is definitely growing and it's big, but it's not necessary. And I don't want to minimize the risk of a clash with China, but I would say that the Japanese Navy could defeat the Chinese Navy. The Japanese Navy is very, very sophisticated and well-trained and has excellent morale, not to mention the U.S.-Japan alliance. So I think any power transition is like science fiction to me. There's definitely a shift because China has a lot of money. So that means that the ratio of American power to Chinese power is not as overwhelming as it once was, but that's not the same thing as a power transition, in my opinion. Well, all U.S. allies in Asia or in Europe have to continuously evaluate the reliability of the American commitment to their defense in terms both of objective American power. Does the U.S. have the capability to fulfill its defense commitment, as well as in terms of American political will, which certainly is always a questionable thing, and it's appropriate for allies and quasi-allies, India, Vietnam, to assess those factors, capability and will. But what I'm saying is that, in my opinion, the U.S. capability is not declining radically, and that Chinese capability is increasing, but not in a way that will overtake American power in any foreseeable future. You can't sort of say what's after the rebalance. I think the rebalance was a symbolic statement, and what was there before was a robust American presence in the region, and what's there afterwards is a robust American presence in the region. And the future, foreseeable future, whatever that is, 10 or 20 years, I think, is not one that will see a dramatic change. That China will, we hope, because China will continue to grow, because actually that's a good thing for China, for the global economy, and so on. And as it grows, I would expect the Chinese to continue to pursue their security interests, which will create some incidents someplace in the South China Sea or someplace in the East China Sea. But I don't see a war breaking out. I don't foresee Korea, for example, tilting to China and breaking the U.S. alliance or weakening the U.S. alliance. Of course, that will be decided here in Korea. But my prediction would be that the Koreans will continue to place great value on the U.S. alliance. I think that's true in Japan. There are many moving parts. What will happen in China, because that political system is susceptible to change. Will nationalism continue to rise in Japan? Will North Korea remain stable? So all of these things that are kind of exogenous to the U.S.-China relationship itself may change the environment and may serve the interests of China more so, or serve the interests of the United States more so. And those will affect the U.S.-China relationship also. And I would say that what the Chinese model is right now is a it's an authoritarian system sitting on top of a very modern economy and a big middle class of 300 or so million people. So kind of a modern society. So this is something we haven't seen before in history. And I think where they're heading with that, in my mind reading of the Chinese leadership, because it's not very clear and different scholars have different opinions about this, is I think they want to further institutionalize the system, make it more and more responsive and accessible to the public without letting go of the reins of control, without allowing an independent press, without allowing civil society that's independent, without losing control. So in the West, we would say this is a contradiction in terms it's impossible. But I don't think the Chinese leadership considers that to be impossible. I think that's their vision. Now, could any of this work for North Korea? So I'm doubtful that it could. I think North Korea faces a number of different conditions. One of them is that when Deng Xiaoping embarked on this path that he had embarked on, he was welcomed by the West. It was something that the United States and the rest of the West wanted. But, and they did not consider Deng Xiaoping to be somebody who had committed crimes against humanity. Deng Xiaoping had a very good image. Even Mao had a good image, although Mao had created many, many crimes. But at the time that Nixon visited China, Mao was pretty popular, and there was no attention was paid to the human rights crimes that he had committed. But the Kim dynasty has been branded by the UN Commission of Inquiry as having committed crimes against humanity. I think it's very difficult for the West to strike a kind of Nixon-Mao strategic bargain with the Kim dynasty. That's one thing. Up until now, I've spoken sort of about the good side of the Chinese model, but I think it has a lot of vulnerabilities to it. Some of those are with the ethnic groups, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the Tibetans, and not exactly an ethnic group, but the semi-autonomous area of Hong Kong, and the fact that they don't have control over Taiwan, and even at a lesser scale of threat to them, the Korean residents in the Yanbian border area. That China is a country with a lot of domestic complexity in large parts of its territory, and those groups all have foreign policy implications. The Uyghurs have a diaspora in Kazakhstan and Turkey, Germany, the United States. The Tibetans have a diaspora in India and get some support from the Indian government, and Taiwan is supported by the United States, and Hong Kong is supported by international public opinion. And in the Chaoxianzhou area, the Chosen-jok area of Yanbian, there's a lot of South Korean and all kinds of foreign people visiting there and engaging in missionary work and things like this. So China's internal politics have foreign policy implications. And then in Shanghai, Tianjin, Chengdu, Wuhan, all of these places, there's the intellectuals and the civil society are also connected to the outside world in a way that makes the Chinese leadership feel that they're under attack from the outside world and that their domestic political system is under attack. So they're very sensitive to the idea of color revolution. They have an idea that I think is rather exaggerated, that the outside world has people who are trying to overthrow them and who really present a threat to their survival as a regime. The interests of Korea will never be 100% identical with the interests of China. That's natural. It doesn't mean the Chinese are bad, but you have your own interests. You have your own trade interests. You have your own diplomatic interests. You have a different value system from China. You have a lot of Christians in your country. It's a very religious country, et cetera, et cetera. You respect the Dalai Lama. You have economic ties with Taiwan, and so on. So it's natural that the Chinese will want to influence you in their direction, and because this is a major middle power, you're going to want autonomy. So the answer to it is obviously balance, between China and the United States, not to tilt. But does that balance require an adjustment in the U.S. ROK defense arrangement? Well, you have the North Korea factor right now, so I think it's very difficult to give up the U.S. alliance in the face of the North Korean threat. After unification, that may be a trickier question, but my own prediction, it's not for me to make policy or suggest policy, but my prediction will be that future Korean statesmen will want to retain the alliance with the United States as a way of balancing against Chinese influence. but perhaps it would be possible to change the deployment of American troops. You might not need the hair trigger troops that you have, or the amount of deployed troops that you have. Well, I think an issue like this has two tracks. One is the sort of technical track that the South Korean defense experts will have to evaluate, and I don't know the answer to it, but does the THAAD really work? Does it provide a value added for the defense of South Korea from a threat that actually exists? In other words, do you believe there's a North Korean missile threat? Do you think the THAAD would be an effective defense? Does it have a value added in defense terms? If it does, that weighs on the side of using it. And that may weigh quite heavily, because you really need that defense. If it doesn't really work, or if you don't believe that the North Koreans pose a threat to South Korea, then that consideration is much less important. And then there's a symbolic or political consideration here, which has to do with what signal do you send to the United States and what signal do you send to the Chinese. And we'll have to see how the two sides play it, but I noticed that the Chinese side has perhaps overplayed their hand a bit, which is something they've been doing lately, I think, a bit in their relations with some of the Southeast Asian countries and so forth, which is to act like a big power and you have to do what I say, and I think that creates an incentive for South Korea to send a message back to China saying, you know what, we're a sovereign country and we're actually a pretty big power ourselves. And, because you're calibrating the relationship between Seoul and Beijing as you respond to their rhetoric and to their deportment. So from a symbolic point of view, I think the Chinese may have pushed South Korea to push back. And on the U.S. side, so far, I think it's been handled a bit more skillfully, where the U.S. is saying, you're a sovereign country, we're recommending this, but it's up to you, kind of a thing, because I think it's dangerous for South Korea to send a signal to any great power that, we're afraid of you and we're gonna, we don't want to offend you. South Korea has to continue to insist on its autonomous policy-making position, because that's always the struggle for South Korea, is to protect its autonomy. But I would say it's very important for the U.S. to handle its relations with its allies in a way that doesn't create a counter-reaction. So if any U.S. official fails to consult the South Korean side adequately, or fails to show respect for South Korean sovereignty, that would be a big mistake. And we should expect pushback